Before you close your eyes tonight, take a moment with me. Where are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Pause, breathe, and tell me in the comments below. I read every single one. This isn't just a story. It's an invitation to drift gently through a world just beyond waking, a dream layered in quiet wonder, soft memory, and surreal beauty. If this brings you peace tonight, please tap the like button and subscribe. It helps this story reach someone else who might need rest too. Now, let's begin. It began, as most things do, with a summons you never asked for and could not return for a refund. The sort of message that arrives not by courier or dove, but by deeply unsettling instinct and the sudden urge to pack exactly one pair of socks. The sky was somewhere between philosophically gloomy and intervention-worthy gray. You arrived at the temple gate as if the universe had filed your arrival under pending and forgotten to tell you why. A monk opened the gate with the expression of someone who had long since abandoned surprise as a useful emotion. He didn't speak. Monks rarely do in situations like this. He merely gestured, not unlike a maitre d' at a restaurant where the food is spiritual enlightenment and the dessert is existential dread. You followed. Because of course you did. What else was there to do? The temple grounds were quiet in that overly dramatic way sacred places often are, as if nature had conspired with architecture to hush the entire world, just long enough to make you nervous. Lanterns flickered with the same energy as low-level anxiety. Trees leaned in, not helpfully. Then came the priest. He was old in the way that mountains are old, stoic, immovable, and probably more weathered than necessary. The brazier in the room hissed like it knew something you didn't, which it probably did. Tea was waiting. This was either very kind or extremely suspicious. No one spoke, no one explained. There was only the slow, inevitable handoff of a silk-wrapped mallet, as though you'd won a raffle you never entered. Snow began to fall. The kind of snow that seemed to whisper, "You'll regret this," in an eerily passive-aggressive way. You climbed the stairs. They were steep, in that traditional test your resolve and your thighs kind of way. With every step, you became more convinced that staircases in ancient temples were designed by sadistic philosophers. The bell sat at the top, big, impressive, smug even. You looked at the priest. He nodded in the universal language of, "Go ahead, it's only the fate of the cosmos." You swung the mallet. The bell rang, not so much a sound as a seismic shift in reality. It was the audio equivalent of an eyebrow raise from the universe. Then, silence. Big, existential silence. And snow. Always snow. You awoke, which was odd because you couldn't recall sleeping. It was the sort of waking that suggests you've merely been misplaced by reality for a while. Sliding the door open revealed a courtyard so snowy it could be accused of showing off. Everything was blanketed, muted, possibly judging you. Tracks crossed the snow. Birds, maybe a fox, perhaps the ghost of last night's sense of purpose. Your own footprints? Not a chance. The snow had standards. The koi pond had partially frozen. The fish stared up with the blank indifference of beings who had long since accepted their roles as ornamental metaphors. You wandered, because that's what people do in places like this. A monk was gently brushing snow from a lantern the way one might erase a regret without removing the lesson. He looked at you as if to say, "Ah, you're still here. Fascinating." You passed trees bent under the snow like interns at a bureaucratic temple of nature. The path turned, narrowed, and eventually you stumbled, gracefully of course, into a walled garden. At the center, one perfectly ironic pine tree. At the base, a brush daring you. You knelt. You raked. Spirals, lines, the occasional accidental smiley face, which you quickly smoothed over. Meaning, if it existed, was in hiding. You stood, or perhaps levitated. Memory was fuzzy. The snow resumed its relentless campaign of aesthetic domination, and the temple, as always, pretended not to notice. You returned to the chamber because there was literally nowhere else to go. The temple seemed to rearrange itself when you weren't looking, much like your dignity after an awkward social encounter. The priest was already seated, or possibly had never moved. Time operated differently in his vicinity, less like a forward-moving current and more like a puddle of soup. He motioned to the brazier again, which had now added an extra hiss for dramatic flair. You sat across from him, carefully trying not to knock over anything sacred, spiritual, or structurally questionable. The tea was poured. Again. Was it the same tea? Different tea? Was it ever tea at all? The steam curled like it had secrets, and you were too polite to ask. The priest cleared his throat, not to speak, of course, but to indicate he could have, which in monastic diplomacy counts as a full TED Talk. He handed you a scroll. It was tied with a thread so thin and fragile it looked like a metaphor for your mental state. You untied it, expecting ancient wisdom, or perhaps a shopping list. Instead, you found a single line. To ring the bell is to be heard by everything that listens. You looked up. He nodded. The brazier hissed once more, smugly, and the snow still falling. Because, of course it was. You assumed that once a bell had been rung and a cryptic scroll read, you'd be excused from further architectural climbs. But no. Apparently, enlightenment requires frequent cardio. The priest gestured, the stairs waited, and you, ever the compliant metaphysical tourist, obeyed. These were not the same stairs as before. These were worse. These were stairs that had opinions. Each step creaked with the gravity of forgotten confessions and poorly executed life choices. You passed alcoves filled with dusty relics, a cracked mask, a fan with a single feather, a stone that looked suspiciously like it wanted to speak. About halfway up, you questioned your life, not just in a general moody way. You genuinely forgot what species you were for a moment. At one landing, a scroll hung on the wall, bearing the words, "Those who ascend must carry their absurdity with grace." You nodded, mostly because you were too out of breath to laugh. You kept climbing. The higher you went, the quieter it became. Not in the usual sense. This was a silence that had tenure, the kind of hush that makes you aware of every sound your body makes, including ones you weren't previously familiar with. And then, finally, you reached the top. The room was circular, wooden, suspiciously symmetrical. The bell loomed larger here, as if gravity itself deferred to it. This time, the priest did not follow, which was odd, or perhaps deeply polite. You stepped forward. The mallet was already waiting. You considered writing a complaint to whatever agency oversees mystical labor conditions, but opted instead to sigh dramatically. You swung. The bell spoke. And this time, you listened. The sound that emerged was not what you'd expect from a bell. It was less clang and more existential suggestion. It didn't echo, not exactly. It expanded. It inflated the silence around it like someone gently inflating a very solemn balloon. You didn't hear it with your ears. You felt it in your teeth, in your regrets, in the strange creak your knee makes when it's about to rain. Somewhere, a deer paused mid-chew. Somewhere else, a man dreaming of misfiled taxes sat bolt upright and promptly forgot why. The sound meandered through the valley, not in a hurry, pausing occasionally to admire the view or whisper unsolicited advice to trees. You stood there, mallet still in hand, wondering whether you'd just rung a bell or opened a wormhole. There was no difference, really. The floor beneath you felt warmer, not flashy, not dramatic, just present. Little pulses along the wooden beams, a glow around your hands, the faintest shimmer in the corners of your vision, like someone had applied a tasteful Instagram filter to reality. A low hum began, not from the bell, from the space itself, as if the very walls were doing vocal warm-ups. And finally, for no reason that would hold up in any respectable philosophical court, you began to understand things, small things, big things, unhelpful things. You remembered a childhood friend's laugh, the taste of a fruit you'd never eaten, the feeling of being perfectly alone and perfectly okay with it. You closed your eyes. When you opened them, the bell was still, the lights gone, the hum, a memory. You were alone, again, still, perhaps forever. But at least the snow had stopped, for now. The tower stairs did not descend so much as dissolve beneath your feet. One moment you were heading downward, the next you were somewhere else entirely. There were cobblestones beneath you, oddly warm, which was either deeply reassuring or cause for mild concern. Around you, Kyoto shimmered, not the Kyoto of maps or tour guides, but the Kyoto of someone's dream, possibly yours, possibly the bell's. You passed a woman with fox ears who was bargaining with a pigeon. They both looked extremely busy and moderately offended by your existence. Cherry blossoms bloomed sideways. A pagoda floated upside down, held aloft by what could only be described as aesthetic defiance. You wandered. A child with eyes like inkwells handed you a rice cake. It tasted like the smell of snowfall. She said nothing, but nodded with the solemnity of a librarian in a library where thoughts were shelved by intensity. You continued. Music drifted from nowhere, somewhere between flute and foghorn. A cat in ceremonial robes bowed to you, then vanished into a mirror that wasn't there. You were not alarmed. You were, at best, mildly intrigued and slightly underdressed. Eventually, you came to a clearing. The snow here glowed faintly, as if moonlight had taken up part-time residence. In the center stood a figure. It was you. Only not you. You, if you'd taken that other path, or said yes to that strange invitation, or hadn't ignored that one feeling. You looked at each other and immediately understood nothing, which felt about right. Then you blinked, and they were gone. Or perhaps you were. The snow resumed its quiet applause. Somewhere in the background, a fox laughed, and the bell, long silent, continued to echo, but only inside you. You emerged into a courtyard that hadn't been there before, which, given everything, felt perfectly normal. The walls were made of bamboo, but they leaned like they were conspiring. The gate had no hinges, just intent. A garden waited inside. Not in the usual way gardens wait, but in the way a trap waits. It was circular, perfectly raked, with black stones that gleamed even though no light touched them. In the center stood a plum tree in full bloom, despite the snow, naturally. A sign read, "You must sit here until the moon says otherwise." The moon, being notably inconsistent in matters of scheduling, said nothing. You sat. Around you, the snow ceased, not because it was done, but because it had paused to listen. The silence here was different. It didn't press or judge. It hovered, like a cat deciding whether to knock over your sense of self. A figure entered the garden, not through the gate, but sideways, as if they'd slipped in through a narrative loophole. They wore robes made of mist and had eyes like unopened letters. "I am the archivist," they said, "of all the thoughts you nearly had." You nodded, because of course. They produced a small wooden box. Inside, a single bell, miniature, elegant, improbable. "You may take it," they said, "but only if you understand what it means to remember something you've never known." You took it. The garden sighed. Petals from the plum tree began to fall, not downward, but inward. The archivist bowed once with the gravity of a celestial bureaucracy. Then they were gone, and once again you were alone, with a bell in your hand and a garden watching, waiting, as always. When you finally stood, the garden did not sigh in relief. It merely adjusted its posture slightly, the way one might shift in a waiting room chair that's been warm too long. You stepped through an opening that had not existed a moment ago, or perhaps always had. A corridor appeared, lined with paper lanterns suspended from nothing in particular. They bobbed slightly, like polite jellyfish. Each lantern pulsed gently, as though breathing. Upon closer inspection, they weren't lit by flame, but by quiet memory. You recognized one, your first lie. Another, a birthday song from a voice long vanished. A third, the feeling of knowing the right answer and being too shy to say it. You walked, slowly, because anything faster felt like an insult to the path. The corridor twisted inward, looping like a well-mannered spiral. Occasionally, a lantern would flicker in recognition as you passed, as if saying, "Still here? How curious." Eventually, the path opened into a small chamber. At its center, a floating book, unbound, yet perfectly legible. Its pages turned themselves with theatrical laziness. You stepped closer. On the pages, your story. Not in metaphor or code or riddle, just plainly you, but also not. The names were wrong, the places familiar but impossible. You'd never worn a crown of feathers, and yet there it was. As you reached out, the book snapped shut with the efficiency of a bureaucratic denial. A voice somewhere behind your spine said, "Not yet." You turned. There was no one. Of course. Another lantern drifted down and gently nudged your shoulder. A new path revealed itself to the left, a bridge, impossibly narrow, made of nothing more than fog and poetic confidence. It led into darkness, which by now felt like an invitation, so you went, because of course you did. The bridge was the kind of structure that looked like it had never failed, but only because it refused to acknowledge the concept of failure. Each step released a soft chime, as if the mist itself had a musical opinion. The darkness thickened, not in menace but in texture. It was like walking through velvet thought. Your body moved forward, but your mind stayed just a half step behind, trying to catch up with its own interpretation. Eventually, the fog fell away, revealing a circular chamber, vast and echoing. The floor shimmered faintly beneath your feet, ripples moved outward with each step. Not water, not glass, something in between, something with opinions. Then the floor spoke, not loudly, not with sound, but with memory. Wherever your foot landed, a flicker bloomed, tiny scenes from lives you hadn't lived, a wedding beneath crimson trees, a boat drifting toward an impossible sun, a child naming constellations in a language you only understood in dreams. You tried to step carefully, which made it worse. More stories erupted with every movement, more visions, more lives. They overlapped and tangled until you weren't sure which version of you had actually arrived. Above, a ceiling of stars blinked into existence. You weren't sure if they were real or reflections of all the stories walking across this room before you. Then, a voice, not yours, whispered, "Choose the moment that doesn't belong." A challenge, a riddle, a joke? You stood still. The chamber held its breath. And in the sea of unfamiliar memories, you found it. A single vision, quiet, still, blank, no colors, no people, no plot. Just snow falling on a garden with no footprints. You stepped there. The room exhaled, the stars dimmed, and the next door opened. The door led not to a corridor or a hall or a vast mountain range with dramatic musical cues. It opened to a small room. In fact, calling it a room was generous. It was more of a spatial opinion. The walls were soft, made of some material that whispered to itself. The air shimmered faintly, not with heat, but with remembered sound. You stepped inside. The door vanished. Of course it did. There was a chair. It looked like it had been expecting you for centuries and was quietly annoyed you were late. You sat. And then the room began to speak, not in a voice, in voices, many, all familiar, all strange. It was every word you'd ever spoken, every word you'd meant to say, every silence you mistook for mercy. The room echoed with forgotten conversations, laughter that never reached its destination, sighs you thought you'd buried, every "I'm fine" that meant the opposite. They circled you, not accusing, just present. You listened, you winced, you smiled. And then one voice cut through the rest, clear, calm, unmistakably yours. "Are you ready?" it asked. You thought about snow, about bells, about doors that vanish and gardens that wait. "Yes," you said, and the room fell silent, completely silent. And in that silence, comfort, then light, and finally, something else entirely. The light did not arrive with fanfare. It unfolded gradually, like a well-mannered sunrise that didn't want to inconvenience anyone. It filtered through your thoughts before it touched your skin. When your eyes adjusted, though to what you weren't entirely sure, you found yourself standing at the threshold of a gate. It wasn't ornate or symbolic. In fact, it looked suspiciously like every unremarkable gate you'd passed in your life and ignored. The kind people walk through without realizing something has changed. There was no guardian, no riddle, no test, just a small plaque nailed loosely to the frame. It read, "This way, if you must." You looked back. The corridor, the room, the garden, the bell, they were all gone. Or perhaps they had never been anything other than versions of this gate, folded into themselves like polite origami. You stepped through. Immediately the air changed. There was the scent of broth somewhere nearby. Wind moved through trees you could name. A dog barked in the specific cadence of a memory you hadn't accessed since you were 7. Kyoto. Not the mystical one, the real one, the concrete and bicycles one, the quiet alley and vending machine one. You were here, but not the same. In your pocket, something cold and round, the small bell. It didn't ring. It didn't need to. You began to walk, and as you did, the world around you gently rearranged itself, not for you, but with you. A nod from a stranger, a shimmer in a puddle, a plum blossom out of season. The ordinary, now permanently suspect. And though the snow had long since melted, you still left no footprints. Not anymore. It started, as most improbable things do, with a cup of tea. You hadn't ordered one. You hadn't sat down. But there it was, delicate, ceramic, steaming slightly in the chill morning air of a Kyoto side street that looked like it had been placed there as a favor to curiosity. Across from you sat a man who may have been ancient or simply very tired. He wore spectacles designed for close inspection of cosmic truths and a robe patterned with gears that never repeated. "I wind clocks that don't tell time," he said, by way of greeting. "They record moments that might have happened." You nodded because what else could you do? He poured you tea. It smelled like the first breath after a snowstorm. "The bell changed your frequency," he continued. "You're not entirely here anymore, but not entirely gone either. You exist in the moments between seconds, where things happen sideways." You took a sip. The world paused. Not dramatically, just briefly. A bird mid-flap, a bicycle refusing to fall. The sound of a temple bell caught in its own echo, and then motion resumed. The clocksmith smiled, not kindly, not unkindly, just knowingly. "You'll start noticing things now, and they will start noticing you." You wanted to ask who they were, but the tea told you better not to know just yet. You finished the cup, and the table, the street, and the clocksmith politely folded into mist, leaving you alone. Except, of course, you weren't. Not anymore. Rain arrived without rain clouds, as if it had been waiting in queue and was simply called forward. You looked up and saw nothing, which, given everything, was oddly comforting. People began to appear, not walk, not gather, appear, each holding an umbrella, but not ordinary umbrellas. These were fantastical contraptions of silk and shadow, of twine and thought, of bird bones and laughter. They didn't repel the rain so much as engage it in philosophical debate. One umbrella hissed steam, another glowed softly with constellations, a third emitted the soft sounds of a distant coastline. You had no umbrella, but a child no taller than your hip tapped you with one shaped like an octopus and handed you another. It was covered in cryptic stamps, like a passport belonging to a very indecisive ghost. You opened it, and suddenly, you weren't walking on pavement anymore. You were drifting. The entire parade began to lift, umbrellas floating up like quiet declarations of intent. You rose with them, not far, just enough. Below, Kyoto shimmered, and then shifted. It wasn't entirely itself anymore. It was older, younger, a mix of centuries tumbling over each other politely. People below didn't seem to notice, or they did, and were simply being polite about it. The child next to you giggled. "Do you see it now?" they asked. You did. At the very center of the floating umbrellas, high above the clock towers and tiled roofs, was a door. waiting. You expected resistance, an ancient lock, a riddle in verse, perhaps a test involving metaphysical ethics, but the door simply opened. No creak, no flare of light, just a quiet acceptance, like a nap beginning. Inside was a room you'd never seen but recognized instantly. It had the smell of pages turned too slowly, of dust that remembered everything, of time misplaced. It was circular, of course. Stories tend to prefer roundness. In the center stood a fountain, not of water, but of ink. It flowed upward, suspended, rewriting itself mid-air, then vanishing before it could fall. Around the walls were shelves. A woman stood beside the fountain. Her hair was a cloud that hadn't decided what season it was. Her expression was the kind that had read the ending already, but wasn't telling. "You've crossed the threshold," she said. "Now it begins again." You didn't ask what, not out of fear, but because you already knew. The ink began to rise higher, the room tilted, not physically, but narratively. And before you could wonder where you were supposed to go next, the floor decided for you. Down you went, like punctuation at the end of a thought too long held, into the chapter yet unwritten. You landed gently, as if the story itself was cushioning your fall. Around you, silence rearranged itself into rows. You were standing in a library that didn't seem to end. Aisles curved upward into impossible spirals, vanishing into shadow and starlight. The shelves held books that hadn't been written, thoughts that hadn't yet occurred, memories from lifetimes never pursued. Some volumes glowed faintly, others whispered, a few snored. A floating sign hovered nearby. It read, "Reference desk, all questions answered, few explained." You moved cautiously. The air was heavy with intent. Near one shelf labeled "Decisions That Changed Nothing," you noticed a book with your name on the spine. It pulsed softly, like a small animal asleep. You reached for it. "Careful," came a voice. "Some pages rewrite the reader." An elderly librarian stood behind you. He wore a vest made of footnotes and glasses shaped like ampersands. "These are the futures that might have been," he said. "Places you never went, people you never became, versions of your story that flinched instead of leapt." You looked down at the book again. "Can I read it?" you asked. "Of course," he said, "but only aloud, and only if you're willing to remember afterward." You opened the book. It was written in a hand that looked suspiciously like yours, but more hopeful or more tired, hard to say. The first sentence read, "Once, in another version of Kyoto, the bell never rang." You began to read. The room adjusted its breathing, and somewhere, far below or far above, a clock began ticking sideways. The clock's ticking grew louder, but not urgent, more like it was clearing its throat. A passage opened in the far corner of the library, beyond a curtain of shimmering punctuation marks. You passed through them, and they rearranged behind you into an ellipsis. There stood an elevator. It looked unremarkable. Brass buttons, velvet floor, no numbers, just directions, left, right, elsewhere. You stepped in. The librarian did not follow. The doors closed with the sound of a page turning. A soft chime rang. You pressed elsewhere. The elevator didn't move up or down. It shifted laterally, though not physically. The floor hummed beneath your feet, and outside the transparent walls, scenery streamed past. A parade of might-have-beens, never-wills, and almost-weres. A garden you never entered, a kiss that hovered but never landed, a letter that reached the wrong address at exactly the right time. Each scene lingered, then blinked away. At one point, the elevator passed through a moment of silence so profound it felt like velvet on your skin. And then it stopped. The doors opened. Before you, a corridor lit by moonlight and memory. At the end of it, a train platform, waiting, not for a train, but for you. The corridor narrowed, as if shaped by hesitation itself. Each step you took whispered back at you, echoes and voices you almost recognized. The platform at the end wasn't modern, nor was it old. It was simply inevitable. Wooden benches sat in quiet conference with moss and time. A vending machine sold only blank tickets. The timetable displayed phrases instead of destinations. Eventually, when ready, perhaps. A figure stood at the edge of the platform. They wore a coat lined with train maps of places that didn't exist yet. They turned without surprise. "You've ridden the sideways elevator," they said. "Most people get off too early." You joined them at the edge. There was no track, just fog. "Where does this one go?" you asked. They smiled. Not where, when, but not the kind you're used to. You waited. Something shimmered in the mist, an outline. Not a train, but the idea of one. It pulled in without sound, its windows flickering with moments you'd nearly forgotten, a hand you almost reached for, a doorway you almost crossed, a goodbye you never said. The doors opened. "Tickets, please," said a voice from inside. You reached into your coat. There, folded neatly, the bell. You handed it over. The conductor nodded. "Plenty," they said. "Plenty enough." You stepped aboard, and the train moved forward, sideways, then backward, then in a direction you had no name for. It was perfect. It was easy to miss. The narrow staircase tucked behind the vending machine. No sign, no light, just the faint scent of rosemary and something older, like ink on forgotten letters. You descended. The air grew cooler, not in temperature, but in tempo, as though time had decided to slow its breathing. At the bottom, a cavernous chamber stretched outward, filled with staircases leading in every direction. Some rose, some fell, some twisted sideways into corridors of soft music and flickering lamplight. You chose the staircase that pulsed faintly with indigo. Halfway up, or was it down, you passed a woman sipping tea from a thimble, seated cross-legged on a hovering stone. "Which memory brought you here?" she asked, not unkindly. You paused. You weren't sure. She nodded, as if that were answer enough. At the end of the stairwell, a doorway, shaped like a question mark, opened into a courtyard of unspoken thoughts. Paper boats floated in midair, each carrying a single handwritten word. You caught one. It read, "Begin." And so, you did. The courtyard faded behind you, replaced by something that might have been a garden if it weren't so undecided. No rows, no hedges, just paths that curved without purpose, and benches facing places no one seemed to sit. The sky above this place shifted colors like a mood ring, never repeating. You stepped cautiously onto a trail paved with broken sentences and half-formed questions. Trees whispered nearby, not in wind, but in syllables. You caught one. Remember. You didn't answer, but you listened. Ahead, you found a small table set for two. One chair was empty. The other held a coat, your coat, one you'd lost years ago and never missed until now. You sat. A teacup warmed your fingers. Across from you, the chair remained vacant until it wasn't. A figure appeared, not dramatic, not sudden, just present, vaguely familiar, like a character from a book you barely remember, but still dream about. They spoke with your voice, or rather, a version of it. "You left me here," they said. You nodded. "I wasn't ready," you replied. The other you smiled, sadly. "Neither was I, but someone had to go." You drank in silence. It tasted like all the things you meant to say, but couldn't. And when you stood to leave, the figure remained. Not out of resentment, out of duty. Some parts of us stay behind so the rest can move forward. You bowed gently. The path reopened. And the sky above whispered, "Continue." The path narrowed, then vanished. In its place, a slender bridge stretched across what could only be described as a sea of shifting moments. They lapped at invisible shores, carrying the scent of déjà vu and the sound of almost recognized laughter. The bridge had no rails, no ropes, nothing to hold it in place except its insistence on existing. You stepped onto it. Each step echoed not beneath your feet, but behind your eyes. Memories you hadn't invited resurfaced. That time you turned away, the name you forgot on purpose, the letter you almost sent. Halfway across, you paused. The sky above turned reflective. You saw not your face, but your choices, worn like layers, translucent and patient. A shape waited at the other side, not quite human, not quite shadow. It offered no gesture, just presence. "Do I cross?" you asked. "You already are," it replied. So you walked, and with each step, the bridge rebuilt itself behind you, as if to say, you could return, but not to the same place. You reached the far side. The figure was gone. Only a small folded paper remained. It read, "Now begins the part you write yourself." You left the marketplace with a thimble tucked in your coat and your pockets rustling with loose metaphors. Eventually, the winding streets gave way to stillness. Not silence, stillness. At the center of it stood a single room, freestanding with no walls around it, just space giving it permission to exist. Inside it was small, comfortable. A lamp hummed quietly beside a worn chair. A table bore a single book with no title, and beside it, the bell, the one that began this all. You sat, and the room, sensing your readiness, closed around you, not like a trap, but like a blanket. You opened the book. The pages were blank, but the bell rang softly, and words began to write themselves. You are here. You were always here, and now you may rest. You closed your eyes. The world, whichever one this was, sighed gently. Not an ending, a pause, a breath between stories, a return disguised as a goodbye. As the lanterns flicker and the gentle breeze carries whispers through Kyoto's quiet streets, let your thoughts drift like cherry blossoms on the river. You are safe, you are still, and all is calm now. If this journey brought you peace, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drift with us again. Sweet dreams, traveler of the universe.